The famous English poet Philip Larkin once wrote, "Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley Ban and the Beatles' first LP." His words struck a chord among the generation that grew up in post-war Britain. Back then, it certainly seemed for many that sex was something that was rarely seen and barely ever heard, even if the continuing baby boom suggested it was definitely going on somewhere. In the late 1950s, before the sexual liberation of the 60s, and long before the phrase swinging London was ever coined, sex was a concept shrouded in secrecy, a basic human instinct which was to be tended to behind as many closed doors as possible. Yet society's suppression of it meant that exponents of the world's oldest profession were rarely short of customers. It wasn't difficult to work out why lone women lined the streets of West London suburbs like Bayswater, Holland Park, and Notting Hill after the hours of darkness. It was safe to assume that they weren't waiting for number 10 bus. Likewise, in the dimly lit back streets of England's capital city, it was common to find cars parked up and lovers snatching a few precious minutes away from the disapproving gaze of their parents, with whom many couples still lived even after getting married. Some married men also frequented these spots without their spouses, in the company of the street girls referred to previously. Such men were prepared to pay for the kind of services which nice girls, such as their wives, wouldn't provide. Duke's Meadows, on the banks of the River Thames in Chiswick, West London, was one such spot, crudely nicknamed Gobblers' Gulch by locals, in reference to the sexual practices said to be popular there. However, something considerably more sinister than the usual discarded prophylactics greeted police as they patrolled the towpath early in the morning of June 17, 1959. They stumbled across the body of a woman sat up against a small willow tree, her blue and white striped dress torn open to reveal her breasts and some scratches on her throat. She had been strangled. The body was found to be that of Elizabeth Figg, also known as Anne Phillips. Prostitutes often changed their names after convictions for soliciting. Her backstory was a familiar one. She came to London after her mother kicked her out for the last time, sponging off a string of ne'er-do-well lovers and dodging rent-demanding landlords. Even in this relatively non-violent era, police were not entirely unaccustomed to finding the dead bodies of prostitutes. Many lived lives full of violence, dealt out by brutal pimps, jealous boyfriends, and rogue clients. Tarts were the lowest of the low, and many had a barely more respectful opinion of themselves, considering such batterings as an occupational hazard. Fig was paunced, the word used back then for pimp, by her Trinidadian boxer boyfriend, Fenton Baby Ward, and while he wasn't above knocking her about a bit, he was soon ruled out by police inquiries into the murder. Besides, there was something unusual about this particular dead body. In London of 1959, the kind of sex murders that often feature on this website were practically unheard of. Infamous British murderers like Hay and Christie had been few and far between, and neither were early examples of the modern-day serial killer who slays strangers and discards their corpses like human garbage. To find a dead body abandoned nearly naked in a public place was shocking even for experienced detectives, suggesting this was different to the crimes of passion, violence, or avarice that police were used to. Yet despite house-to-house inquiries, interviews with prostitutes, pawnces, taxi drivers, and night shift workers, no strong clues were found as to the killer's identity. As the case slowly went cold, Elizabeth Figg and the strange case of the semi-naked corpse were forgotten. It would be more than 4 years before anyone had cause to mention her name again. Although the pair never met, 22-year-old Gwyneth Rees had a lot in common with Elizabeth Figg. Both had come to London as teenagers, having suffered unwanted pregnancies and fallen out with their families. Rees was from South Wales, Figg from the northwest of England. Both had come to London looking for a more glamorous existence than small-town Britain could offer. Yet, like so many naive young girls before them, they'd fallen into the twilight world of prostitution, chased from pillar to post by violent pimps, corrupt landlords, and sleazy punters. At the time of their deaths, both were also suffering from a common problem for ladies of the night, sexually transmitted diseases. Rees's body, naked but for a nylon stocking, was found barely a mile along the riverbank from Elizabeth Figg's on a garbage dump on the opposite side of the river on November 8, 1963. A post-mortem revealed several teeth were missing, and she had, in all likelihood, been strangled with a ligature. She'd been last seen nearly 6 weeks earlier getting into a car with a man on the night of September 29, 1963. When police looked into her background, they found no shortage of potential suspects. Rees was paunced by a man named Cornelius Connie Whitehead, a violent criminal who would later be convicted as an associate of notorious East End gangsters, the Cray Twins. He thought nothing of delivering regular whackings to his girls, which may have been one reason why Rees left him shortly before her disappearance and why he was reportedly looking for her. That summer, she'd become pregnant. This was another common predicament for prostitutes in the days before the contraceptive pill became widely available, since insisting on the use of condoms was likely to reduce your appeal to potential clients. She already had 2 children, neither of which were in her care, and abortion was still illegal in the UK at that time. Fellow prostitutes said that at the time of her disappearance, she'd been looking to contact an illegal abortionist she knew of. 2 terminations she had previously undergone had left her with an infection of the fallopian tubes. That was hardly surprising given the methods used. Typically, these amateur physicians would fill a syringe with boiling water, antiseptic, and melted soap, and squirt the resulting liquid deep inside the hapless patient, aiming to trigger a miscarriage within 48 hours. It usually worked, but there were obvious dangers associated with it, such as the above-mentioned condition or even blood poisoning. Yet, investigators had to ask themselves, even if Rees had died as a result of the abortion, and certain guilty parties had to get rid of her body, why dispose of her naked corpse on a garbage heap by the Thames, where it was always likely to be discovered? And why strangle her? Whatever the cause of her death, once again, police had precious little to go on other than speculation and casual suspicions. Inevitably, their investigations were hampered by the widespread disdain for the police that existed in the outlaw world which prostitutes inhabited. Indeed, neither of the above cases lived long in Londoners' memory. Where prostitutes were concerned, there were rarely many worried friends and family members insisting on finding out exactly what happened, and many privately believed that tarts such as Rees and Figg had only themselves to blame. Even fellow prostitutes regarded the deaths as the equivalent of industrial accidents, unfortunate but inevitable given the dangers inherent in their line of work. Within a few months, this unloved sector of London society would be walking the streets in a climate of fear, the like of which they'd never experienced. When the body of 30-year-old Hannah Tailford was found by rowers on the Thames shore near Hammersmith Bridge on February 2, 1964, the similarities to Rees and Figgs's corpse were uncanny. Naked, apart from a pair of stockings, she had also been strangled, several teeth were missing, and her semen-stained underwear had been stuffed into her mouth. It was an ugly end to a life that had seen precious little beauty. Born to a mining family in the northeast of England, Hannah was excluded from several schools as a child due to disruptive behavior. As a teenager, she ran away to London, where she was soon on the game, gaining convictions for soliciting and theft into the bargain. She became so desperate that on one occasion, she even placed a classified ad in her local newspaper, offering her unborn baby for sale to the highest bidder. The last confirmed sighting of Tailford was on January 24th, and pathologists estimated that she could have been in the water for a week or more. As with Rees, there were several lines of enquiry that appeared to present themselves. Tailford was said to have connections in a murky world of underground sex parties and stag films. She frequented a coffee stall near Trafalgar Square where she was known to have been offered money to have sex on camera. One individual connected to these activities committed suicide a few days before Hannah Tailford was found. In his book on the case, Found Naked and Dead, Brian McConnell reports that Tailford told friends of being paid to participate in bizarre orgies at the homes of aristocrats. Such stories tallied with the lurid tales of high society sex parties revealed during the Profumo scandal of 1963, in which a British government minister's affair with a call girl was exposed. Tailford told a friend she had attended an orgy at the home of a French diplomat named André, and on another occasion had been paid £25, roughly $45, and taken by limousine to a house where a man in a gorilla costume had sex with her while a crowd of upper-crust revelers cheered him on. Could Tailford have been silenced by someone with connections to this sleazy world? Tempting though the theory might have been, it seemed unlikely. Nevertheless, during the investigation, police interviewed hundreds of people who they knew to have consorted with prostitutes, among them an international soccer player and several clergymen. Yet the possibility that Tailford had fallen victim to a maniac, as the newspapers put it, was shortly to become even more terrifyingly plausible. On April 8, 1964, the naked body of 26-year-old Irene Lockwood was found in the Thames at a spot almost equidistant between the final resting places of Elizabeth Figg and Hannah Tailford. Two naked bodies by the river in a matter of months might be considered an unfortunate coincidence. 3 dead girls, added to another near the same spot a few years earlier, could only lead to one conclusion: a killer was on the loose. The body had been in the water less than 48 hours, but she'd evidently been stripped and placed there post-mortem. Once again, she'd been strangled with some kind of ligature, probably fashioned from her own clothes. Familiar facts about the dead woman soon emerged. Lockwood was a street girl of only 5 feet in height. The 3 others were all 5'2" or under, and like the others, she'd suffered from an STD. Like Hannah Tailford and Gwyneth Rees, she was pregnant. She too had been forced to seek illicit medical assistance for an abortion and had recently taken pills which she thought were working because they made her tummy move. She'd been last seen outside a pub in nearby Chiswick on the 7th of April. On the face of it, there might have been any number of reasons why someone would want to take this young woman's life. Her friend, Vicky Pender, had been found battered to death in her North London flat a year previously after having tried to blackmail clients over photographs she took of them, and there's no doubt Lockwood wasn't averse to similar scams. In his recent book on the case, Jack of Jumps, David Seabrook tells how a favorite trick of Lockwood's was to take clients to a flat where she would insist they take their trousers off outside the room before having sex, at which point 2 male friends would emerge from a hiding place and go through the unfortunate punter's pockets. She was no angel. But who was in the world of thieves, pimps, and hustlers these women inhabited? Given such an environment, police never knew whether to believe anything they were told by associates of the dead girls. Many of them had a lot to hide themselves about their nighttime activities. That said, even the natural secrecy of vice girls was being eroded by the climate of fear that was spreading across London. Notting Hill in the early 1960s wasn't the fashionable, well-to-do suburb of London that it is now. Several decades before its gentrified new image was presented to the world in the Hugh Grant and Julie Roberts movie of the same name, its nickname was Rotting Hell. Back then, it was a run-down, insalubrious corner of West London which housed the lodgings of Caribbean and Irish immigrants, largely because those communities were turned away from more upmarket addresses. Prostitutes and criminals also found accommodation here, the former often being put up by the latter in return for a large slice of their earnings. Since these people often kept unorthodox working hours, numerous illegal late-night drinking clubs catered for them in the basements and back rooms of shops and apartments. Often the people operating such establishments were tenants themselves, and landlords would turn a blind eye to their activities in return for increased rent. One such operation was run from the caretaker's quarters of the Holland Park Lawn Tennis Club. Although by day a respectable establishment, if you knew the right people, you could get an after-hours drink in the club, accompanied by a motley crew of night owls. People would often disappear into the courts to make merry with the hostesses, hookers, and good-time girls they met there. The caretaker involved in this scheme was 57-year-old former soldier Kenneth Archibald, and he knew Irene Lockwood among many other ladies of the night. He wasn't averse to utilizing their services himself from time to time. Indeed, police had found a business card with the name and number of Kenny on it in Irene Lockwood's apartment, leading them to interview him about her murder. He denied ever having known Lockwood and claimed the card got into her hands via a third party. But when he then returned to Notting Hill Police Station on April 27, 1964, his memory had suddenly been jogged. He admitted to have known Irene Lockwood and then dramatically confessed, "I killed her. I've got to tell somebody about it." He led detectives to the Chiswick pub where she'd last been seen, then to the spot where he claimed he'd argued with Lockwood over money. "I must have lost my temper," he said, and put my hands around her throat. I then proceeded to take her clothes off and rolled her into the river. I took her clothes home and burned them. However, it was soon discovered that Archibald could not have been responsible for Tailford's death or that of Rees and Figg. Police were convinced that at least one of those murders were committed by the same man. At his trial in June of that year, he retracted his confession and pleaded not guilty, claiming he was drunk and depressed when he made it. There was no evidence against him other than his own confession, and police resisted the temptation to believe that this bumbling old fellow with the hearing aid was their man, despite their desperation to catch the killer. Police were back at square one. Detectives' firm conviction that they had a serial killer on their hands had been reinforced further only 3 days before Archibald's startling statement, when police were confronted with a fifth naked body, one for which, again, Archibald could not have been responsible. The naked body of 22-year-old Helen Barthélemy was found dumped in an alleyway in Brentford on April 24, 1964, barely 2 weeks after Irene Lockwood had been found. Despite the dry land location, a couple of miles from the other murders, any doubts that this murder was an isolated incident soon disappeared. The signs of strangulation or asphyxiation were there, and once again, the dead woman was a small street girl who'd suffered from an STD in the past. Whether these facts were significant to their murderer's motive or not, the similarities were too numerous to ignore. Before she arrived in London from the northern seaside town of Blackpool, Barthélemy had previously been convicted of luring a man to a desolate spot where he was attacked with a razor and robbed, and she frequented similar pubs and drinking dens to Irene Lockwood. In fact, she'd left her handbag with a friend in one such club, saying she was going out for a short time. She never returned. Despite the usual lack of clothes, the state in which her body was found would later become significant to the investigation. For a start, it was filthy. That suggested that it had been stored somewhere before being left in the alleyway. More promisingly, there were microscopic specks of different colored paints on her skin. Analysis of the paint revealed that it was identical to that used in automatic paint spraying of cars, furniture, and metalwork. Detectives concluded that the body had been hidden in some kind of storage building to which only the killer would have access, since this kind of paint could be carried in the air and penetrate tiny gaps in the walls of such a building. If forensics and police could work together to narrow down that location, they would surely be halfway to catching the killer. Even before the discovery of this fifth body and the emergence of the paint spots clue, police were convinced that there was evidence and suspects out there to be considered, if only they could find them. The very fact that the girls were naked suggested to police that the killer was keen to leave as little evidence as possible around the bodies. It seemed unlikely that the girls would have ended up naked of their own accord. None of them were in the habit of undressing for sex. These were girls who plied the car trade, and the only disrobing normally required would be to hitch up their skirts and pull down their underwear in the client's passenger seat. That suggested they were being killed, then stripped naked after death, and their bodies were taken to the river, or in this new case elsewhere, for disposal. Where were those clothes now? Where had the bodies been taken to be stripped? Had anyone spotted the killer's car? Whatever the answers, the mystery man didn't appear to be a frenzied madman violently snuffing out his victims in a fit of psychosis. It all appeared quite calculated, designed to leave as few clues to his identity as possible and to perplex police. Other bizarre elements of the case also threw up questions. Why were several of the girls' teeth missing? Was it just a sign of their profession that all the victims had suffered from STDs in the past and 3 were pregnant at the time of death? Could these details be significant in guessing the killer's macabre motive? One senior detective, Detective Superintendent William Baldock, joined the investigative team after Barthélemy's body was discovered, and he propounded the startling theory that the women might have been choked to death during the act of fellatio. Yet you have to ask, if that were the case, why wouldn't the women have bitten their killer on the very sensitive part of his anatomy with which he was choking them? Even if they'd lost a couple of teeth, this would surely still have been possible. Author David Seabrook, who was granted access to closed police files on the case while researching his recent book, Jack of Jumps, dismissed the fellatio theory as a fairy tale born of ignorance about such taboo sexual practices in the 1960s. Yet it perhaps reflects the state of clutching at straws to which investigating officers had been reduced. Traditional police vigilance didn't seem to have paid off so far. Extra police had been employed to watch comings and goings around the River Thames after Lockwood's body was found, in the hope that if the killer struck again, he might just be caught red-handed or at least be spotted in the vicinity for future reference. But no sooner had that trap been laid than Helen Barthelemy's body was found, this time away from the river. It was almost as if their quarry was second-guessing detectives' next moves and keeping himself one step ahead at all times. It was almost as if he knew how the police operated. As a reflection of how seriously police were now taking this case, overall control of the investigation had been taken by Commander George Hathrow, head of Scotland Yard's CID. On April 28, 1964, 4 days after Helen Barthelemy's body was found, he took the unusual step of making a public appeal to prostitutes to come forward with any information which they may regard as relevant to the investigation. He promised the women absolute secrecy and stressed that they were the very ones most at risk. Police fear that if information's not forthcoming, yet another prostitute may be found dead. In particular, police wish to interview anyone who has been made to strip or has been assaulted. Within 48 hours, 45 female prostitutes and 25 men had come forward, and Hatherill announced that the appeal's impact has been staggering. Meanwhile, the registration numbers of cars seen in the area after the hours of darkness were logged by teams of police, and female officers walked the streets disguised as prostitutes with tape recorders in their handbags, hoping they might come face to face with a suspect. Prostitutes, for their part, were arming themselves with knives in the hope of defending themselves against attack. Helen Barthelemy had carried one, and 30-year-old Scott Mary Fleming did the same. She was nothing if not streetwise, and after 10 years on the game, she wasn't scared by much. She used to boast that she'd once fought off a client who tried to strangle her with the very knife she still carried. Indeed, when her naked body was found in a quiet residential street early one morning, it showed signs that she'd put up quite a struggle. She'd been punched forcefully in the heart, unlike the other girls who had apparently been dispatched with a minimum of violence. There was also another notable aspect to this depressing new development. As with Helen Barthelemy, minuscule particles of industrial paint were present on the body. It was barely 2 months after Hatherill's appeal, and this body, like Helen Barthelemy's, could hardly have been left in a more public place. It was also in Chiswick, West London, right in the middle of the area where police presence was heaviest. The prevailing view among investigators was that this was deliberate, a calculated attempt to make police look stupid. Never mind STDs, pregnancies, or sexual perversions. Could a grudge against the police be the motive? If so, he was certainly making life difficult for them. The press were now referring to the killer as Jack the Stripper, an obvious but apposite pun on the name of Britain's most notorious prostitute killer. Pressure was mounting on detectives to make progress in the case before another body was found. 8,000 people were interviewed and 4,000 statements taken, but it got them no nearer even to drawing up a short list of possible suspects. Frustratingly, neighbors reported hearing a vehicle reversing down the street just minutes before the body of Mary Fleming was discovered by an early-rising chauffeur at 5 a.m., but no one had actually seen the vehicle concerned. Surely, figured police, if he was taking these kinds of risks, it was only a matter of time before the killer was caught. Yet it was to be several months before they got any closer to knowing anything at all about this elusive individual and his macabre homicidal habits. Throughout the summer of 1964, as well as arming themselves with knives, many London prostitutes worked in pairs in order to keep watch on each other's movements and provide witnesses should anything untoward occur. 21-year-old Edinburgh native Frances Brown, also known as Margaret McGowan, and her friend Kim Taylor jokingly teased each other about the possibility of meeting the murderer over a drink at a Notting Hill pub on the night of October 23, 1964. When they were approached on the street by two motorists shortly afterwards, they split up and got into the pair's separate cars, although not before taking a look at one another's client. Taylor later told police that her friend got into either a Ford Zephyr or Zodiac and failed to return. She'd spent over a month fearing the worst before, on November 25th, Frances Brown's body was found on a side street in nearby Kensington. The hallmarks of Jack the Stripper were all evident. A small prostitute, erstwhile STD carrier, stripped and left for dead, paint spots on the body. Curiously, like Hannah Tailford, Brown had minor connections with the Profumo affair, having testified in the court case to having been hired by Dr. Stephen Ward, a society osteopath who procured hookers for powerful men. However, Kim Taylor's witness statement seemed a far more promising lead. The resulting identikit pictures showed a round-faced man of medium height and sturdy build. Police believed he may have been visiting London for the nearby Earl's Court Motor Show and might have connections to the motor trade. Meanwhile, a silver cross on a chain and a gold ring had been stolen from the victim. Could the killer be collecting trophies from his victims? Psychologists also suggested that the killer was in all likelihood an outwardly meek and mild individual who was probably small in stature and picked on small women who he could overpower. But vague conjecture such as this was unlikely to lead to an arrest. A witness identification just might. Could someone put a name to the identikit's face before another body was found? By the beginning of 1965, despite having interviewed thousands of people and examined hundreds of possible leads, the killer was still at large, and detectives were privately preparing themselves for the killer to strike again. His previous victims had been found at intervals of no longer than 3 months apart, suggesting he'd be looking to feed his murder lust once more. Yet it wasn't until February 16, 1965, that the naked body of 28-year-old Irish prostitute Bridie O'Hara was found behind a storage shed on an industrial estate in Acton, less than a mile from where Mary Fleming had been found. As the news hits the headlines, the head of Scotland Yard's murder squad, Detective Chief Superintendent John Durose, was recalled from holiday to take charge of the investigation. He was nicknamed 4-Day Johnny for the speed with which he'd solved cases in the past, and he immediately doubled the force of officers working on the case. Every vehicle traveling around West London during the hours of darkness had its details logged, and any car found curb crawling for prostitutes was put on a special interview list. Many a red-faced family man found police on his doorstep, ostensibly making inquiries about a traffic incident before being led somewhere more private where more specific questions were asked about his nighttime habits. Since Bridie O'Hara's body had been found with the telltale paint specks on it, Durose also focused his attention on the mammoth task of finding the origin of the paint. After an extensive search of over 24 square miles, a matching paint sample was finally found beneath a covered transformer at the rear of a building on the Heron Trading Estate, mere yards from where the body of O'Hara had been found. The premises were found to face a paint spray shop, tallying with detectives' initial deductions. Another significant fact was noted in that O'Hara's body had been partially mummified, which suggested it had been stored near a source of heat. The transformer fit the bill perfectly. The killer's hideout had been found, and it seemed it had been right under the noses of detectives all along. Convinced they were inching ever closer to finding their man, over 7,000 people on the trading estate were questioned, cars were logged, and police made a series of upbeat statements to the press. Durose claimed they'd whittled down their list of suspects to 3, and that figure would soon shrink to 1. He privately expressed the hope that the killer would panic at this news and give himself away. His optimism didn't prove entirely unfounded. After these new developments became public, no more bodies were found. Could the murderer have suddenly curbed his terrible urges in the knowledge the police would now be scrutinizing every single individual setting foot in West London? It was possible, but John Durose would later claim that he knew otherwise. For a long time after the last murder, it was widely felt that the police had failed in their attempts to find the man who at that time was Britain's worst ever serial killer. That perception may partly explain why 5 years after the last murder, the by then retired Duros claimed in a BBC television interview that he knew the identity of Jack the Stripper. Furthermore, he said, detectives had been preparing to make an arrest in March 1965 when news reached them that the suspect had committed suicide, gassing himself in a lock-up garage in southwest London. He explained that the press and television publicity had been orchestrated to frighten him and make him run. Eventually, he said, it had the effect we desired. He became so frightened, he took his own life. In his 1971 memoir, Murder Was My Business, Duros repeated this claim, saying the man had left a suicide note explaining that he was unable to take the strain any longer. Author Brian McConnell fleshed out the suspect further in his 1974 book Found Naked and Dead. He nicknamed the murderer as Big John, a respectable man in his 40s with a wife and several children. He'd suffered a grim childhood in Scotland, characterized by extreme Puritanism and frequent beatings. While serving in World War II, he developed a habit of using prostitutes and would often turn to violence when drunk to give vent to his feelings of self-loathing. He later joined the police force, but was turned down for promotion to the detective ranks, turned to drink again, and eventually quit. John eventually found work as a security guard and worked on the heron trading estate where the bodies were believed to have been stored. McConnell claimed he nursed a grudge against his former colleagues, which formed part of the motive for the killings. Both Duros and McConnell refused to reveal Big John's true identity for the sake, they claimed, of the killer's living relatives who remained oblivious of the suspected killer in their midst. But if they thought these revelations would finally bring the story of Jack the Stripper to a close, they were mistaken. For many years, Duros and McConnell's version of events were unofficially accepted. Yet even then, their views were not unanimously accepted. An investigation by Owen Summers in the Sun newspaper in 1972 revealed that the man who Duros and McConnell suspected was in Scotland at the time of one of the murders. His findings were all but ignored at the time, but some 35 years after the last murders, author David Seabrook began researching the book on the case, entitled Jack-a-Jumps. He was granted unprecedented access to the original police files on the case, and after several years of painstaking research, he came to a quite different conclusion. I've proved Duros to be corrupt, he says. He framed a dead man to grab up a bit of glory on the cheap and avoid being seen as having failed. Both Duros and McConnell are dead now, so they can't reply to such controversial accusations. But after looking at the files, Seabrook does name Duros' dead suspect as a Scot from Putney named Mungo, Ireland, and comes to the same conclusion as Owen Summers that he could not have been responsible because he was in Scotland at the time of Bridie O'Hara's murder. Furthermore, he says, there was very little other evidence to confirm his guilt. He spent only 3 weeks as a security guard on the heron trading estate, Seabrook points out, and there was no other link to the crimes. What we do know is that on the 3rd of March 1965, Ireland was found dead in his car in his lock-up garage. He committed suicide by inhaling the exhaust fumes. He left a note to his wife, but its meaning is hard to ascertain for sure. I can't stick it any longer, he wrote. It may be my fault, but not all of it. I'm sorry Harry's a burden to you. Give my love to the kid. Farewell, Jock. P.S. To save you and the police looking for me, I'll be in the garage. So why would the police be looking for him, you may ask? Well, it may not be what you think. He was due in court the same morning on a minor motoring offense. Notably, his registration had not been logged by the surveillance teams on the case, and his wife admitted they'd experienced marital difficulties, which seems likely to have been what my fault refers to. Harry was his brother, who may well have been staying with the couple. So if we accept that the case against this man was shaky, to say the least, were there any other likely suspects? Well, one of Duros' most senior colleagues believed so. Seabrook also claims another senior detective working on the case, Detective Superintendent Bill Baldock, disagreed with Duros' findings and deeply resented Duro's going public with his claims, but didn't want to publicly contradict his superior. However, Seabrook says Baldock believes the killer to be another suspect, whom Seabrook outlines in Jack of Jumps. This individual was younger than Ireland, but he was also a former policeman who'd good reason to have a grudge against the police. He was kicked out of the force in the early 1960s after being convicted of a series of petty burglaries in the area he patrolled. He later admitted that his motive had been bitterness at missing having been previously accused of corruption. My feeling, he admitted at the time, was that if they thought so strongly that I was a black sheep, then I'll show them and be a black sheep. He wanted to make life difficult for his former colleagues, committing crimes which they would then spend many hours trying to solve with no success, since he himself was disposing of evidence. Seabrook's theory is that the killer murdered the girls with the same motive, to humiliate his former colleagues. He backs up his claim by pointing out the fact that the last 6 bodies, police never officially confirmed if they believed the deaths of Elizabeth Figg and Gwyneth Rees were definitely part of the series, were all found in different police substations. Very few people would know of these areas of jurisdiction apart from a former police officer. Seabrook's suspect had actually worked in all but one of them. After leaving the police force, he worked as a car salesman, which would have given him considerable opportunity to travel around London. The Heron Trading Estate, meanwhile, was easy to access 24 hours a day for someone with local knowledge. Baldock wrote of this man in his original report. This man cannot be eliminated from the enquiry, and it's felt that he's still a strong possible suspect. The circumstances surrounding his mental history, knowledge of the area, and background are ideal in every respect for his being the murderer. But obvious questions remain. Why did he stop killing? Admittedly, police presence in West London was intense, but we know now that the danger of being caught is rarely much of a prohibiting factor once a serial killer has become addicted to murder. Seabrook argues that since the old London police boundaries were changed in April 1965, his motive disappeared with them. A plausible reason for a killer to go straight? Your guess is as good as ours. Accounts of the case differ as to whether they consider 6, 7, or 8 of the dead women to be victims of Jack the Stripper. Seabrook's theory regarding the police subdivisions in which the bodies were found works best if we only consider the last 6 victims to be the work of Jack the Stripper. Yet, while the deaths of Elizabeth Figg and Gwyneth Rees were different in some ways, Figg was strangled manually rather than with a ligature, for instance, and not fully stripped, while Rees's body was found on a rubbish heap, albeit by the banks of the Thames. But there are also similarities that seem unlikely to be mere coincidence. Both were prostitutes, and in both cases, the dead women's possessions were removed from the bodies, and Rees was stripped before death. Even if the 4.5-year gap between Figg's death and the rest of the series suggests an isolated incident, the same can't be said for Rees, whose death fits fairly well into the chronology of the other murders. There was also no other convincing motive for someone else to have murdered the women. These kind of murders were exceptionally rare at the time, and the theory that Rees was killed to protect an illegal abortion racket fails to convince. Ultimately, though, the true circumstances and chain of events that led to any of the 8 women's deaths has never been categorically established.